Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled The History of Local History. Local history began in the Western world in the 17th century with William Lombard's Perambulations of Kent in 1656, in which he recorded his walkabouts of that English province. The themes that he discussed in the Perambulations of Kent did not change very much until the late 20th century. These themes were based primarily on narrating local stories, and narrating local accomplishments, and describing local scenes. Now there have been brief breaks, but as we'll see, these are aberrations. Interest in local history arose in the United States during the so-called early national period from the era of the Constitution until 1815 to 1830. This was a period when states were the central governmental unit in the nation, rather than the federal government, and national history was understood to mean the combined history of all the states. This was an era when nationalism and the nation, as we understand it today, were not well defined, and one could be equally loyal to the vague nation as they could be to the real and present locality and state. From the time of the writing of the Constitution through the Civil War, powerful states wanted to dominate U.S. historiography, just as they wanted to dominate the nation's politics and economy. In fact, one of the themes that we'll track is the replacement of local and state history by national history, that is, the way we understand the nation today, in the late 19th century, and the return of the importance of state and local history for far different reasons in the late 20th century. Central to these changes is the identity and occupation of those who were interested in collecting the necessary documents and producing the local and state histories over time. We also want to look at the role played by historical societies in this trajectory. Well, let's look first at who promulgated local history from about 1790 through about 2000 and study the changes that occurred during that same 200-year period. David Van Tassel's discussion of how Jeremy Belknap founded the Massachusetts Historical Society provides our first glimpse of who was interested in history enough to write it. Belknap friends in 1788 Boston were physicians, jurists, and book dealers. John Pentard of New York, who was one of the people that convinced Belknap to found the Massachusetts Society and who later founded the New York Historical Society, was a wholesale dry goods merchant and one of the grand sachems of the powerful Tammany Society. Your author Carol Common reports that local history authors prior to 1870 were local patricians with sufficient time and income to allow them to indulge their love of the past. She calls these people gentlemen writers. After the year 1815, we see the rise of local boosters, those people who tried to promote immigration to their town or county, and those with community pride, whether it was justified or not, beginning to dominate the production of local histories. One manifestation of this rise was the rise of state historical societies that challenged the power that had been exercised, and we'll study in a minute, that of Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania to determine the course of history writing in the United States. In addition, with the entry of local boosters to the promulgation of local history, we see local history responding to market forces. Much of this trend followed everything else in the United States at that time. That is, the replacement of subsistence economies by market economies as an economic and even social force, the rise of market-dominated Jacksonian democracy, the beginnings of the struggle to define what it meant to be a nation and who exercised power in that nation. An event that Van Tassel calls documania, particularly after 1826, became a driving force as well as a result of expanding market forces for what we would call history books. I'll leave it to you to read Van Tassel for the extraordinary period in local and state records gathering and publication. But a good example of the intersection of history with the market is the story of one of these commercial publishers. As Van Tassel recounts, just after the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 1826, Congress was set to let a contract for publishing Revolutionary Era records, a project that eventually came to be called the American State Papers. Publisher Peter Force had bet his entire fortune on securing that contract and gathered documents for 9 years before applying for the contract. You can see him in the image here. He was a wily person timing his application in the wake of completing a previous congressional contract, and he made a strategic partnership with the clerk of the House of Representatives. Obviously, Force secured that contract, and he published 9 volumes of records covering the period 1763 through 1789 over the following 20 years, until another presidential administration pulled the plug on his funding. Now in the 1830s through the 1850s, we see another group begin concentrating on very narrow concerns in local history. These are lineage researchers, or as we like to call them, genealogists. They arose because industrialization began to replace commerce as the dominant economic activity in New England cities, and German and Irish immigrants began to arrive, pushing out old merchant families of Anglo-Saxon stock, at least from their social power. These old Anglo-Saxon merchant families then tried to secure their place in this changing society by asserting, quite frankly, their ancestors. Genealogists did good here. They preserved many records and the memoirs about their localities that would not have been secured otherwise. But their interests in boosterism, antiquarianism, filiopietism made their local histories very parochial. After the Civil War, a split arose between those who practiced local history and national history for a variety of reasons, and we'll look at a couple of those here. One was the rise of university-trained professional scholars who were inclined by the spirit of the times across the Western world to look at the nation state as the most important topic of study. The other is the rise of educated women who took over much of the work of local history as they did churches and philanthropy. Over the course of only a few years, professional historians had created in colleges and universities departments of history. They had made professional organizations like the American Historical Association that protected and promoted their interests both before the public and in legislatures. And they had frozen women and male amateur historians, those who were usually associated with both state and local history, out of the picture. Now, local historical champions of the 20th century were different but oddly similar to those of earlier years. In the 1910s, patriotic societies like the Daughters of American Revolution blossomed, keeping local history alive. And a couple of decades later, newspapers published popular columns on local history as entertainment. Commercial publishers flashed again in the 1920s in particular, continuing to find a niche market for local history as edutainment. In the 1960s, though, we see a shift. New trends among professional historians led to the legitimization of new fields of social history, cultural history, labor history, black history, and women's history. These are all called history from the bottom up, and they revive interest among academics in local and state history. History as entertainment did its part as well to revive interest in local and state history, and particularly important are the TV miniseries Roots, Ken Burns' The Civil War, as well as the History Channel on cable. Finally, academic historians, who really are pretty powerful in the way history is portrayed in the United States, have discovered that their job market shrank, and they want to prepare students for careers outside the professoriate. Local and state histories are untapped labor markets for their students. Along with who was writing history, we also need to look at the infrastructure for local historical practices, that is, the rise of the historical society. There's a precedent in the antiquarian societies of England and Scotland for American historical societies, and the American Historical Society founders of early years corresponded with the English and the Scottish societies to try to figure out how to conduct their business and structure themselves. The first American Historical Society was Jeremy Belknap's Massachusetts Historical Society, founded in 1791 and chartered by the state in 1794. Belknap eagerly sought to collect historical manuscripts and public records, and he conducted a letter-based survey of towns throughout what was then the United States, asking about long-lived residents, notable events, notable deeds, and the beneficence of the climate. He also published much of his research in bits and pieces in his society's journal Collections. Within a decade of the founding of the Massachusetts Historical Society, that is, in 1804, dry goods wholesaler and Tammany Hall Grand Sachem John Pintard of New York had founded the New York Historical Society. One of his partners in this, DeWitt Clinton, who later became governor, secured a legislative appropriation in 1814 of $12,000. In 2014, that same amount would be $166,000. This money went to support the programs of the New York Historical Society. A little bit further south, in Pennsylvania, in 1815, a group there created themselves as a committee of the American Philosophical Society. They broke away in 1824 to become the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Now, all of these groups had ambitions to become national historical societies, the chief keeper of American history. But others disagreed, and they founded state historical societies that scuttled those plans. New England states acted in the 1820s, particularly with the founding, or admission rather, of Maine as a state. Then the western states, what we would now call the Midwestern states of Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana, began creating their own historical societies in the 1820s and into the early 1830s. And then after 1830, we see the southern states creating some long-lived, some short-lived historical societies. Many of these were short-lived because they were creatures of individuals, or they could not secure private or public funding, or they were founded less to preserve and promote history than to demonstrate that a particular city or locality had a certain level of sophistication or a level of civilization. The chart that I'm about to show you demonstrates the growth of the number of societies between 1790 and 1860. You can see that in the first 30 years of that period, there were only 4 societies founded. Then in the next single decade, from 1820 to 1830, we have 10 societies founded. Between 1830 and 1840, we have another 12 founded. And in the last 2 decades, 1840 to 1860, we see 40 historical societies founded in the United States. Not all of these continued. Some of them dropped by the wayside. Some of them continue on even today. Well, what about local historical societies in the 20th century? Well, between the centennial of the Declaration of Independence in 1876 and the bicentennial in 1976, we see the development of these local historical societies in a way that was not particularly beneficial. Now, they got a shot in the arm in 1876 when President Ulysses S. Grant called on people to write the histories of their towns, which led to an increased interest in local history. But by the bicentennial of 1976, it had become obvious that most local historical societies were moribund. They were the preserve of fading town elites who often preserved what little power they had left by reappointing themselves to the boards of their groups. They were not effective at reaching out either. Now, this might not have been intentional. Until the last 10 years, it was unusual for anyone under retirement age to be interested enough in local history to make themselves available for service. There were many other opportunities for them. History had been taught in a way that was dull to them, and people seemed to get a certain age before they have a visceral connection with the past and with their history that makes history important enough for it to become a priority to them. But in the era of the bicentennial until today, this new academic interest in state and local history, history as infotainment, both created an ongoing surge among younger people entering local historical societies. You also cannot discount the rise of the internet with keeping that movement alive. Even as our physical communities add virtual communities to them, we appear to have developed a greater interest in those physical communities. And with that, I'll end this lecture, and thank you very much for your attention.